When you spend 30 years of your life sitting behind a mahogany bench wearing a heavy black robe, you start to believe you've seen every shade of human darkness. But it wasn't until I retired to the quiet outskirts of Willow Creek that I realized just how petty the devil can be when he's wearing a pastel blazer and carrying a clipboard. They tell you retirement is about finding peace, but for me, it was about finding my way back to a version of myself that existed before the law books and the gavels. Back to the girl who grew up with dirt under her fingernails and the smell of sun-dried hay in her hair. I bought this old, weathered farmhouse on a sprawling piece of land because it felt like coming home, and the first thing I did was restore the old cedar grain barn out back. A crooked, beautiful structure that held my father's hand-carved plows, my mother's hand-stitched quilts, and every scrap of history my family had left. It was my sanctuary, a place where the air felt thick with memory and the wind whistled through the slats like a ghost of a lullaby. But apparently, my sanctuary was someone else's eyesore. Enter Beatrice Sterling, the self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, and a woman who clearly had never been told, no, in a way that actually stuck. She showed up on my porch 2 weeks after I moved in, not with a pie or a welcome mat, but with a violations notice and a smile so tight it looked painful, telling me that my barn's, rustic aesthetic, was depressing the property values of the suburban McMansions 3 miles down the road. I tried being the neighborly version of myself, the one who smiles and nods and offers tea, explaining that the barn was a historical structure, fully permitted, and sat on land that had been a farm long before her subdivision was even a blueprint. But Beatrice didn't oppose. T wanted a conversation. She wanted a conquest. And over the next 6 months, she turned my life into a masterclass in psychological warfare. She'd leave these long, rambling letters taped to my door about, community harmony, She'd park her SUV at the edge of my fence and take photos for hours, and she even tried to find me for the height of my sunflowers, claiming they were, unauthorized organic structures, I just ignored her. Honestly, I thought my silence was a shield, and I figured if I didn't oppose, feed the fire, it would eventually burn itself out, but I forgot that people like Beatrice don't oppose. Just want to win. They want to destroy anything they can oppose. Control. It all came to a head on a Tuesday night in July. A night so humid you could feel the air sticking to your skin. When I woke up at 2 in the morning to a sound I'll never forget, the low, hungry roar of a fire that had already found its stride. By the time I got to the window, the barn wasn't oppose. Just burning. It was a pillar of orange light reaching for the stars, and the heat was so intense it cracked the glass of my bedroom window before I could even scream. I ran outside barefoot, the gravel cutting into my feet, and I stood there in the dark watching 60 years of my family's history turn into a whirlwind of ash and sparks. I tried to grab a garden hose, which was a joke, a desperate, pathetic gesture, and as the siren started wailing in the distance, I looked across the property line and saw her. Beatrice was standing by her mailbox, wrapped in a silk robe, watching the flames with this terrifying, serene look on her face, and when our eyes met through the smoke, she didn't oppose. Look away. She just adjusted her robe and walked back inside like she'd just finished watching a particularly satisfying movie. The fire investigators didn't oppose. Take long to find what I already knew. The heavy scent of kerosene at the foundation and a melted plastic jug tossed into the tall grass near the fence line. One of the young detectives, a guy named Miller who looked like he'd just graduated high school, told me it was definitely arson, but whispered that without a witness or a camera, these things usually just end up as cold files. He didn't oppose. Know who he was talking to. He saw an old woman in a charred nightgown with soot on her face. He didn't oppose. See the woman who had overseen federal racketeering cases and stared down cartel lieutenants without blinking. That morning, as the embers were still hissing under the fireman's spray, I walked over to the ruins and found a piece of my mother's quilt, just a tiny charred square of blue fabric, and something inside me shifted. The judge didn't oppose. Just wake up, she took over. I didn't oppose. Called the local police to complain, and I didn't oppose. Scream at Beatrice over the fence. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a burner phone and a laptop and started pulling strings that Beatrice didn't and Oppos to even know existed. See, when you've spent decades in the federal system, you make friends in interesting places, and it turns out that Beatrice had a very paper-heavy life. A life full of HOA embezzlement, kickbacks from local contractors, and a suspicious amount of insurance claims on her own properties. I spent the next week playing a game of digital chess, watching through my window as she held, in quote, emergency safety meetings, in quote, on her lawn, telling the neighbors that my, in quote, neglected barn, in quote, had been a fire hazard all along and that we were all safer now that it was gone. She was so smug, so convinced that she'd bullied me into submission, that she didn't and Oppos. T noticed the black sedans parked down the street, or the fact that the local hardware store manager was handing over security footage of her buying 5 gallons of kerosene and a box of long-reach matches 48 hours before the fire. The climax didn't end Oppos. T happened in a dark alley or a police station. It happened at the annual Willow Creek Community Gala, a high society fluff event where Beatrice was supposed to be honored for her, in quote, distinguished service, in quote, to the neighborhood. I showed up late, wearing the best black dress I owned and a string of pearls that belonged to my mother, and I waited until Beatrice was on stage, soaking up the applause before I walked right down the center aisle. The room went dead silent because I looked like a ghost from her worst nightmare, and when she tried to laugh it off, asking if I was lost, I just leaned into the microphone. I didn't in Oppos. T raised my voice. I used that, in quote, courtroom whisper, in quote, the one that makes everyone in the room hold their breath. And I told her that I'd enjoyed reading her financial records, especially the parts where she'd been skimming from the neighborhood playground fund to pay for her kitchen remodel. Her face went from ivory to a sickly, mottled gray in about 3 seconds, and then I dropped the real hammer, the federal arson warrant. 2 U.S. Marshals, men I'd known since they were rookies, stepped out from the shadows of the banquet hall, and the sound of those handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful piece of music I'd heard in years. Beatrice started screaming, a high-pitched, jagged sound, accusing me of, in quote, using my power, in quote, to frame her, but I just stood there and watched as they led her out past the neighbors she'd spent years terrorizing. She thought she was the law in this town, but she forgot that the law is a living thing, and it doesn't end Oppos. T like being used as a weapon by people with small hearts and big egos. A few months later, the community came together to help me clear the site, and even though the air still smells a bit like scorched wood when it rains, the grass is starting to grow back over the blackened earth. I'm building a new barn, not a replica of the old one, but something new, something stronger, and every time I look at the blueprints, I think about the letter Beatrice sent me from the county jail. She tried to apologize, claiming she just wanted to, in quote, protect the neighborhood, in quote, but I never replied because some things can end Oppos. T be fixed with a stamp and a piece of paper. Justice ISN and Oppos. T about the punishment. Not really, it and Oppos. S about the moment the light finally hits the truth and the shadows have nowhere left to hide. I've realized that retirement, ISN, and Oppos. T about being quiet, it and Oppos. S about having the time to make sure the right stories get told, even if you have to burn the old ones down to do it. But now I'm sitting here wondering if I went too far. Some of the neighbors say I destroyed a woman's entire life over a wooden shack that my, in quote, federal influence, in quote, made the punishment way worse than the crime, while others say she got exactly what was coming to her for years of tyranny. What do you think? Did the, in quote, judge, in quote, and me take it to an extreme, or is there a point where being, in quote, neighborly, in quote, has to end and real justice has to begin? I'd love to hear if any of you have had an HOA nightmare that made you want to call in the feds, or if you think I should have just let the insurance company handle it and moved on. Drop a comment below and let's talk about it, because in my experience, the truth is usually somewhere in the middle, and I'm still trying to find it myself. Don and Oppos. T forget to like and subscribe if you think Beatrice got what she deserved, or even if you think I'm the real villain of Willow Creek.